There is a crop that produces 4,000 pounds per acre without irrigation, fertilizer, or care. It survives droughts that kill corn and grows in sand where wheat starves. Ancient Egyptians placed it in pharaohs' tombs alongside gold and jewels as provisions for eternity. It feeds families for 8 months from a single harvest and needs no replanting once established, returning every year indefinitely. For 4,000 years, it fed civilizations across the Mediterranean. Valencia's orchards alone produced millions of pounds annually, and every family knew how to grow it, harvest it, and prepare it. Then agriculture modernized, and this crop disappeared from fields across Europe and the Americas. The reason wasn't crop failure. Modern agricultural systems cannot accommodate a plant this independent. Abundance that requires no chemical inputs cannot be sold to farmers as an annual necessity. Independence that needs no seed purchases cannot generate perpetual revenue. A crop that grows in abandoned lots cannot be monopolized through patents or controlled through supply chains. This is the history of Chufa, a tuber that outlasted empires and now exists only in the margins of industrial agriculture. 4,000 years ago in the Nile Delta, Egyptians cultivated a small tuber they called shufi. Archaeologists discovered jars of these tubers in Tutankhamun's burial chamber, placed there as eternal provisions alongside wheat for bread and wine for celebration. The plant grows 3 feet tall with grass-like stems, producing dozens of tubers underground per plant and hundreds per square yard. Each tuber is the size of a chickpea with wrinkled brown skin and sweet white flesh. The scientific name is Cyperus esculentus, known in English as yellow nutsedge or earth almond. In Spain, it's called Chufa, and across Arabic-speaking countries, Habel Aziz, meaning the precious seed. Egyptians ate the tubers raw, dried them for storage, and ground them into flour. They pressed oil from the tubers for lamp fuel and fed the residue to livestock, using every part of the harvest. The plant grew along the Nile where annual floods deposited sand rather than rich soil. While other crops struggled in these conditions, Chufa thrived. The tubers survived months of submersion during floods and sprouted when the water receded. 1 acre produced 4,000 pounds of tubers compared to 1,200 pounds of wheat grain under the same conditions. The yield advantage was significant, but the plant's resilience to flooding and poor soil made it indispensable. In 77 AD, Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder documented the crop in his writings, describing it as a food of Egypt and noting its sweetness, digestibility, and medicinal use for stomach ailments. The Romans carried it across the Mediterranean to Spain, where it found conditions that closely matched Egypt's climate: hot summers, mild winters, and sandy coastal soil. During Islamic rule of Spain, Moorish agriculturalists cultivated Chufa extensively in Valencia. They developed irrigation systems, refined cultivation techniques, and created horchata, a drink made from ground chufa, water, and sugar. For Mediterranean communities, this crop provided calories that required minimal tending, nutrition that stored for years, and oil when olive harvests failed. It was infrastructure rather than luxury. From Valencia, cultivation spread along Spain's Mediterranean coast, and by the 18th century, thousands of acres in the region produced millions of pounds annually. The crop's uses continued to expand beyond food. Ground into flour, it substituted for grain during shortages. Pressed for its oil, which comprised 20% of the tuber's weight, it provided a cooking oil comparable to sunflower in yield and similar to almond in taste. The oil burned cleanly in lamps and resisted rancidity. Farmers fed fresh tubers to pigs, which gained weight faster on chufa than on grain. The calculation was straightforward. 1 acre of chufa fed more pigs than 2 acres of barley. In North Africa, Tunisia, Morocco, and Algeria maintained cultivation traditions. People ate the tubers roasted as snacks and mixed them with honey to make sweets. The plants grew wild along irrigation ditches and in abandoned fields wherever water occasionally reached. The crop's success stemmed from its minimal requirements. It needed no fertilizer because the tubers stored nitrogen. It required no irrigation beyond rainfall. Animals underground didn't consume the tubers. One planting persisted for years as tubers multiplied underground, producing more plants annually. Farmers harvested what they needed and left the rest, which remained viable for the following year. During Spain's Civil War in the 1930s, when supply chains collapsed and hunger spread through the country, Valencia survived partially on Chufa from fields that hadn't been harvested in years. The plants had waited underground, multiplying undisturbed. After the war, however, the crop became associated with poverty, rationing, and desperation, an association that would later contribute to its commercial decline. After World War II, Spanish agriculture modernized rapidly, with tractors replacing hand tools, factories processing food, and distribution networks demanding standardization. Chufa proved incompatible with every aspect of this transformation. The tubers varied significantly in size, ranging from pea-sized to marble-sized, making mechanical sorting impossible. Hand sorting was slow and labor-intensive. Harvesting required digging, and mechanical potato harvesters damaged the small, delicate tubers, breaking and bruising them until they became worthless. Hand digging worked but cost more in labor than the crop could justify economically. The plant spread aggressively because each tuber left in the ground during harvest became the following year's plant. Missing even a small percentage during harvest meant finding hundreds of volunteer plants the next season. For home gardens, this persistence was beneficial. For industrial monoculture operations, it was unacceptable. Industrial agriculture's requirements were specific. Crops had to grow in uniform rows, mature on predictable schedules, yield standardized products, harvest mechanically, store without spoilage, and ship long distances without degradation. Chufa failed every requirement. During the same period, Spain began importing vegetable oils from industrial plantations in South America and Southeast Asia. Sunflower, palm, and soy oils arrived refined and ready for distribution through existing infrastructure of warehouses, tankers, bottling plants, and supply networks. These oils cost less than Chufa oil not because they were superior products, but because they integrated seamlessly with industrial food systems. By 1970, Chufa cultivation in Spain had collapsed to a few hundred acres in Valencia, maintained exclusively for horchata production as a protected traditional product and tourist attraction. Outside Spain, the situation was worse. North America, Australia, and New Zealand classified Chufa as yellow nutsedge, a noxious invasive weed requiring eradication. The plant's crime was growing too successfully, competing with monoculture crops, resisting standard herbicides, and persisting in poor soil. 100 grams of dried Chufa contains 400 calories, 24 grams of fat, mostly in the form of monounsaturated fatty acids, 63 grams of carbohydrate with half as resistant starch, 8 grams of protein, and significant amounts of iron, magnesium, zinc, and phosphorus. The fat profile is 73% oleic acid, identical to the heart-healthy fat composition that makes olive oil valuable. Chufa produces this nutritional profile in sand without irrigation. The most significant nutritional component is resistant starch, which passes through the stomach and small intestine without digestion. In the colon, bacteria ferment this starch, producing short-chain fatty acids that reduce inflammation, improve insulin sensitivity, and feed beneficial gut bacteria. Studies conducted in the 1990s demonstrated that Chufa consumption lowered blood sugar spikes in test subjects. Diabetics who consumed Chufa showed better glucose control than those eating regular starches because the resistant starch slowed digestion and prevented insulin crashes. Traditional medicine systems use Chufa for digestive complaints, and modern research has confirmed the mechanism. The fiber content of 22 grams per 100 grams promotes intestinal motility, while the resistant starch specifically feeds bacteria that reduce gut inflammation. Comparing Chufa to industrial alternatives reveals significant differences. Chufa oil contains 73% oleic acid and 10% linoleic acid, remaining stable at high temperatures. Corn oil contains 25% oleic acid and 60% linoleic acid, oxidizing quickly during cooking. Chufa provides 31 grams of resistant starch per 100 grams compared to 2 grams in potatoes. The environmental profile matched the nutritional benefits. As a perennial, Chufa grew year after year once planted, requiring no replanting, preventing soil disruption, and eliminating erosion from annual tillage. The roots fix nitrogen like legumes, improving soil quality rather than depleting it. Water requirements were minimal because the tubers stored moisture, allowing the plants to survive months without rain. Field trials showed Chufa producing full yields with half the water corn required. The plant grows successfully in USDA hardiness zones 6 through 11, spanning environments from southern Canada to Mexico and from coastal Spain to interior Sudan. It thrives at elevations from sea level to 8,000 feet, in conditions ranging from drought to seasonal flooding, and in soil types from pure sand to heavy clay. Industrial agriculture cannot accommodate crops with these characteristics. The system requires plants that depend on annual inputs of purchased seeds, synthetic fertilizers, and chemical pesticides. A crop that needs none of these inputs and persists despite neglect generates no recurring revenue for agricultural corporations. During the 1980s, health food advocates promoted Chufa as a nutritional product based on its fiber content, beneficial fats, and digestive properties. Small companies attempted to commercialize Chufa flour, Chufa milk, and Chufa oil. They encountered the same obstacles Spanish farmers had faced decades earlier. Inconsistent tuber sizes made processing difficult, expensive hand harvesting prevented competitive pricing, and the absence of processing infrastructure and distribution networks meant building these systems from scratch. The resulting products cost 3 times more than comparable alternatives, and consumers consistently chose cheaper options. In Valencia, horchata production continued as a protected traditional product, supported by a few hundred acres of cultivation, mostly hand-harvested, and sold locally or to tourists as a cultural artifact rather than a practical food source. Permaculture communities adopted Chufa because its characteristics aligned with their agricultural philosophy. The plant's perennial nature, self-sufficiency, and resilience made it suitable for community gardens and home cultivation. Seed-saving networks began distributing tubers, maintaining cultivation knowledge outside commercial agriculture. In Africa, communities across Ghana, Nigeria, and Senegal continued using Chufa without interruption. It grew wild and semi-cultivated, maintained by traditional knowledge rather than formal markets. No export industry developed, and no commercial cultivation system emerged. People simply fed themselves as they had for centuries. Scientific research continued sporadically, with studies examining the crop's resistant starch composition, oil profile, and drought tolerance. Papers were published and knowledge was documented, but nothing was commercialized. Because the necessary market infrastructure didn't exist, processing facilities weren't available, and profit margins couldn't justify building them. Today, Chufa exists in 3 separate contexts: Valencia's protected horchata tradition, permaculture, and home gardens in North America and Europe, and wild or semi-cultivated patches across Africa. These are the margins of industrial agriculture, spaces the dominant system hasn't reached or cannot control. Industrial agriculture's requirements explain why Chufa remains marginal. The system demands uniformity, but Chufa produces randomly sized tubers that cannot be mechanically sorted. It requires scheduled maturity, but Chufa produces continuously, with some tubers maturing in 6 months and others in 8, making single harvests inefficient. It depends on mechanical harvesting, but Chufa's delicate tubers break under machine pressure. It requires control over plant distribution, but Chufa spreads aggressively through any tuber. Fragment left in soil. Most significantly, Chufa cannot be patented because wild populations grow on multiple continents. Anyone can collect tubers and plant them. No seed purchases are required. No licensing fees apply. No perpetual revenue stream exists. Agricultural corporations profit from crops requiring annual inputs of purchased seeds, repeated applications of proprietary fertilizers, and continuous use of patented pesticides. Chufa requires none of these. The language used to describe Chufa reveals the economic conflict. In regions where industrial agriculture dominates, official classifications label it invasive, noxious, and pestilent. A crop that fed millions for millennia becomes problematic when it refuses control. Markets demand instant profitability, but Chufa requires patience with modest first-year yields, doubled second-year production, and permanent establishment by the third year. Commercial channels expect uniform appearance, but Chufa tubers resemble dirt-covered pebbles, irregular and visually unimpressive without explanation of their properties. The deeper conflict concerns what Chufa demonstrates: that food abundance does not require industrial control, that food security comes from persistent plants rather than purchased products, and that agricultural resilience depends on diversity rather than uniformity. These principles contradict the fundamental assumptions of industrial food systems. Chufa's marginalization follows a pattern repeated across agricultural history. Amaranth fed the Aztec Empire with more protein per acre than corn and better drought resistance than most grains. Spanish conquistadors banned its cultivation because it was central to indigenous ceremonies and identity, and because it enabled food independence from colonial control. Tepary beans sustained southwestern North American tribes for 5,000 years, growing in desert heat without irrigation and fixing nitrogen in poor soil. Mechanical harvesters couldn't handle the small pods efficiently, and the crop was abandoned as industrial agriculture spread. Mesquite trees fed entire communities through pods ground into flour, provided wood for construction and fuel, and prevented erosion through deep root systems. Ranchers cleared millions of acres of mesquite for cattle operations that destroyed the ecological protections the trees had provided. Breadfruit trees produced 200 pounds of starchy fruit per tree annually, with a single tree providing enough food for a family. Polynesians carried breadfruit across the Pacific as they settled new islands, but colonial administrations preferred dedicating land to sugar plantations that generated export revenue. Indigenous crops that enable food sovereignty face systematic marginalization, not because they fail agriculturally, but because they succeed without generating dependency. Crops that feed people without requiring annual purchases disappear from agricultural systems. Crops that grow without purchased fertilizers lose research funding. Crops that persist without intensive care are reclassified as weeds. This pattern creates specific outcomes. Farmers become dependent on seed companies for annual purchases. Communities become dependent on supply chains for food access. Nations become dependent on global markets for agricultural inputs. The marginalization of independent crops enables this dependency structure. The knowledge that disappears with these crops includes techniques for growing food in harsh conditions, methods for surviving supply disruptions, practices for feeding communities without cash economies, and strategies for maintaining food sovereignty through agriculture. Climate projections make Chufa's characteristics relevant to future food security. Droughts are intensifying in agricultural regions, conventional crops are failing more frequently, water scarcity is becoming permanent in formerly productive areas, and soil degradation is accelerating. Under industrial practices, corn requires 25 inches of water per growing season, while Chufa requires 12. Corn depletes soil nitrogen while Chufa adds it. Corn needs controlled conditions, while Chufa tolerates environmental chaos. In regions already experiencing water stress, industrial agriculture based on water-intensive annual crops will fail to maintain current production levels. The knowledge of how to cultivate, harvest, and use Chufa persists in Valencia's horchata production, in African communities that never abandoned traditional practices, in permaculture gardens, in wild populations along irrigation ditches, and in seed banks storing tubers at -18 degrees Celsius. People still understand the methods for harvesting Chufa: washing it, drying it, storing it, preparing it, and planting it. The plant itself persists underground in margins and spaces industrial agriculture hasn't paved or poisoned, producing tubers whether harvested or not, spreading through fragments left in soil, surviving in conditions that kill conventional crops, and waiting in a form of agricultural dormancy. Chufa has survived 4,000 years of civilizations rising and collapsing, agricultural systems replacing each other, and empires spreading and retreating. It will survive current industrial systems regardless of their stability. When those systems fail, Chufa will remain accessible in Valencia's fields, in every wild patch that refused to die, in every garden where someone planted these tubers, and stored in seed banks for the specific purpose of preserving agricultural options. Chufa demonstrates through its existence that food abundance does not require industrial control, that agricultural survival does not require submission to corporate systems, and that the most resilient food sources are those that cannot be monopolized through ownership. The plant waits underground, small and brown and wrinkled, surviving in soil where it has persisted for 4 millennia while producing food, and refusing control.